All right, Shabosai, good morning. Let us begin. I'm going to begin by thanking our sponsors for this. Thank our Talmuders for the month of Tevis, Yoel Sara Kelman, in honor of the birth of their daughter, Oriya Tahel, and in the schus to the Mir Tashem, all those davening for children should have their tefilos answered Bekarov. To thank Teri Czinn for dedicating the Shurim this month in honor of their grandchildren, Adin, Tzvi, and Naftali Moshe. Thanks Shirley Elbaum Family for dedicating the shiurim this month, the commemoration of the yahrzeit of Shirley's husband, Gerald Elbaum, Yaakov Kopel, R Avraham Menachem. And to thank our week of learning sponsors, Paul and Kathy Pollack, in memory of Paul's sister, Leah Bas Shmuel, during the week of her yahrzeit on the 11th of Teves. And to thank our Daf Yomi sponsors today, Alan and Andrea Stowis, in commemoration of the yahrzeit of Alan's father, Menachem Mendel ben Avram Nasan Zichron Lebrach. We hope that in the merit of our Talmud Torah, all of the neshamas will have an aliyah and their families in a chaman. I will say with that, let us begin. Shechianu v'kiyamanu v'higyanu. We are about to begin the exciting adventure of the last daf of Maseches Taanis. Hard to believe. So we'll say, let's begin. Today's daf is Lamed Aleph 31. We are picking up Emeretz Hashem on the bottom of Lamed Amud Beis, or we'll call it the bottom. So Rabbi Huda Mechai, middle of Lamed Amud Beis. Rabbi Huda Mechai b'kfiyas mitzvah. So we'll say, if you see Tosfos Amar Rava Kitana Didan Lohodlo Chachamim, right across in there in the Gemara. So we'll say, very interesting sugya. Rabbi Huda Mechai b'kfiyas mitzvah Lohodlo Chachamim. Rabbi Huda required the overturning of the bed. So remember again, kfiyas hamita rabosai is one of the concepts that we have by avelos, which is literally the overturning of a bed. So Rabbi Huda said that on Tisha B'Av, you're obligated to overturn the bed, but the Chachamim did not agree with this position. Says the Gemara Tanya, Amru lo Rabbi Huda l'dvaracha, ubros umenikos mate alehen. So said Rabbi Huda, but what should pregnant or nursing women do? Right? At the end of the day, sleeping on the floor, overturning the bed is going to be quite difficult for them. Amar lahen, afani lo amarti ela biyachol. Rabbi Yehuda says, you're right, I'm not disagreeing with that. I'm not saying that pregnant women and nursing women should do that. I'm saying when able to go ahead and overturn the bed, one should say, just by the way, as I mentioned, the concept of kfiyas hamita is not a concept unique to Tisha B'Av, it's a concept in Avelos. The Gesher HaChaim explains why would they overturn the bed? Like, what does that mean, overturning your bed? So it's actually very interesting. The Gesher HaChaim posits, he says that often they had mattresses that were made of straw, different materials like that, which over time, when you would sleep in it, would assume human form, would assume like the form of your body. What do they call these kind of mattresses? Like memory foam. Good, right? So Talmudic memory foam, except it was straw, right? So interestingly enough, so the concept of kfiyas hamita is death is the erasure of the human form. So overturning the bed represents this same idea of erasure of the human form. So Rabbi Huda, and this applies, we'll see this in Moed Cotton. The Gemara talks about this by Hilchos Avelos of kfiyas hamita. Rabbi Huda says the same halach applies by Tisha B'Av. Okay, so Chachamim say, what about ubros umenikos? To which Rabbi Huda says, ani lo amarti ela biyachol. Rabbi Huda says, look, I also don't hold that everyone should do it. Just those who are able to do it should do it. A brayta that supports this. Both Rabbi Huda v'Chachamim b'she'eno yachol. That Rabbi Huda agrees with the Chachamim that if somebody can't sleep on the floor, right, or somebody can't sleep on an overturned bed, don't. Umodim Chacham Rabbi Huda biyachol, but the Chachamim agree with Rabbi Huda with someone who is able to. So someone who is able to do kfiyas hamita, even the Chachamim will agree that they should do so. If that's the case, that they really pretty much agree, right? They pretty much agree. So then, what exactly? There clearly is a machlokas, because there's a machlokas recorded in the Mishnah. My benayu, ika benayu sharmitos. We'll say interesting. The nafkamir, the point of contention between them, ultimately again are the other beds in the house. In other words, is there a din of kfiyas hamita on beds that people aren't sleeping on? Right, beds that people aren't sleeping on. Kidisanya, as we learned, kisha amru lichbos hamita lo mitasa bilbatu kofa ela kola mitos kulanu kofa. But it says the Raisa says when we speak about the concept of kfiyas hamita overturning the bed, it's not just the bed that the mourner or that the individual is sleeping on, but rather you overturn all the beds in the house. So this would be the point of contention. Rabbi Yehuda would hold that you overturn all beds. Which, let's say, for argument's sake, a person has a guest room, right? I'm not sleeping in the guest room. So is there a din of kfiyah samita? Is there a din of overturning a bed that I'm not using? Rabbi Yehuda would hold that halacha l'maisa, all beds are overturned. All beds in the house are overturned. The Rabbanan would say, no, only the bed you're using is overturned. So the Gemara Rabbi says, Hilchasa ketana didan, v'lahodul chacham kolek. Rabbi says, no, the halacha follows our Tana as expressed in the Mishnah, and as expressed in the Mishnah, our Tana does not agree with Rabbi Yehuda at all. So our Tana holds that on Tisha B'Av there is no din of kfiyah samita. There is no halach of overturning the bed, and I will say that is indeed how we paskin. Look, if you look at Rashi, Tosas. Tosas says something very interesting. Amarava hilchasa ketani didan v'lo hodol chachamim perish shein tzarich lipos hamita. So Tosas says the halacha. Rava says the halacha follows the Tana of our Mishnah, and the Tana of Mishnah holds there is no obligation of kfiyah samita on Tisha B'Av at all. There's no obligation. The interesting Tosas Adin over here va'idna techashina l'kshafim lo avdinan kfiyah samita va'afilu ba'avel. So we'll say this is very interesting. So apparently, at some point in time, for some reason, the practice of overturning the bed was interpreted by our Gentile neighbors as a form of sorcery and witchcraft, which again put the Jew in peril, and therefore the practice was discontinued. Therefore, says Tosas, we don't do kfiyah samita at all today, even by hilchos avelos. Again, we'll see this in Moed Katan, that originally overturning of the bed was one of the practices of avelos, just like not wearing leather shoes, just like not sitting on a regular chair, right? Turning over the bed was part of the rituals of mourning. But apparently, says Tosfos, it was discontinued because for some reason it was understood or misinterpreted as a form of witchcraft or sorcery. It's just fascinating. Everyone will say, halacha says no kfiyah samita by Avel. There's no kfiyah samita ultimately by Tisha B'Av as well. Now again, as I mentioned when we did the Mishnah, the Shulchan Aruch Mishnah Berurah do quote opinions who say that there's a midas chasidus to sleep on the floor, or the Mishnah Berurah says to sleep without your pillow on the night of Tisha B'Av. In other words, to do something to make one's sleep a bit less comfortable on the night of Tisha B'Av. Incredible. So we'll say now we transition to the last part of the Masechta, which is really quite incredible. So Amar Rabbi Shimon Gamliel, Lo hayu yamim tovim liyisrael ki chamisha asar ba'av u'kiyom kippur. We'll say such a beautiful Gemara. So Rabbi Shimon Gamliel says there are no happier days, no greater yamim tovim for Klal Yisrael than Yom Kippur and the 15th of Av. So it says the Gemara, I don't understand. Bishlama Yom Kippurim. I understand why Yom Kippur is a great Yom Tiv. Why? Because Yom Kippur is a day of incredible forgiveness. A day of incredible forgiveness. Right? Why? Shenitnu bo luchos ha'achronos. Because the second set of luchos were given on the Kippur. And I both say it's interesting because sometimes people read this Gemara as espousing two different ideas, but it's one idea. What's the Simcha of Yom Kippur? The Simcha of Yom Kippur is that it is a day of forgiveness. How do you know that Yom Kippur is a day of forgiveness? Because Yom Kippur was the day that we were given the second set of tablets, which was the physical manifestation of divine forgiveness for the sin of the golden calf, for the Chet Egel. But if you take a look at Rashi says, Rashi Divrei HaMaskil Shenitnu Bo Luchos Achronos. You can look at this Rashi on your own. Rashi goes through the dates, right? Rashi explains how we know that Yom Kippur was the day that Moshe Rabbeinu descended from Mount Sinai, descended from Har Sinai with the second set of luchos. But if you look at the last 6 lines of Rashi says this is so beautiful. Uboker Yom Kippur Yorad Shu'asara b'Tishrei. On the morning of Yom Kippur, Moshe Rabbeinu came down. The morning of Yom Kippur, which is the 10th of Tishrei, Moshe Rabbeinu came down. Va'oseh Hayom Nikva Yom Kippur. That day, I will say, this is incredible. When Moshe Rabbeinu came down with the luchos on the 10th of Tishrei, it was then that the day was established as Yom HaKippurim, as the Day of Atonement. Lodia Shemachal v'nicham ala roshel diber lasos liamo v'al kain nikvat som kippur ba'asara b'tishrei kach shamati. I both say this is incredible. You see, what Rashi's saying over here is what made Yom Kippur, right? What made Yom Kippur into a day of slicha or mechila? What made it into a day of forgiveness? What made it into a day of forgiveness was the fact that Moshe Rabbeinu came down from Har Sinai with the second set of luchos, which again, those second set of luchos was the sign that HaKadosh Baruch Hu had forgiven us. Once Moshe Rabbeinu came down with the second set of luchos, then Yom Kippur was established as a day of forgiveness. Now watch this. I'll show you something amazing. Take a look at Tosfos. We are finishing the Masechta today, by the way. Take a look at Tosfos. So we'll take a look at the end of Tosfos. I'm sorry, last Tosfos. Yom Shebo Kalum. Oh no, sorry, not yet. No, we'll come to that Tosfos. Even though again that Tosfos can be a little bit related to this, we'll leave that. So we'll say it turns out, by the way, that Yom Kippur itself, the identity of Yom Kippur as the day of Slicha or Mechila, was not present before they're bringing down to the second set of tablets. The identity of the day is concretized and solidified by that event. So says the Gemara, I understand why Yom Kippur is a day of simcha, but Elatu B'Av Ma'i, back to the Gemara, what's so special about the 15th of Av? What's so special? We'll say, now watch this. The Gemara is going to go through a whole bunch of reasons why Tu B'Av is a Yom Tov. This is so beautiful. So first answer. Amar Yehuda Amar Shmuel Yom Shehutru Shvatim Lavo Zeh Bazeh. Both say it was the day, Tu B'Av was the day that it was decided that the Shvatim are permitted to intermarry. Now both say, why can't Shvatim intermarry? This goes back to the story of Benos Tzlafchad. What's the quote unquote, the danger in allowing Shvatim tribes to intermarry? Is you're going to end up messing up tribal, we'll call it tribal real estate allocations, right? Because remember, again, every shevet has its own land in Eretz Yisrael. Here's where it becomes a problem. Let's say a woman from Shevet Binyamin marries a man from Shevet Yehuda, and this woman happens to be an only child, no sons. When her father dies, she will inherit her father. Well, if she inherits her father, the property becomes hers. If she then predeceases her husband, or for that matter, even if she doesn't predecease her husband, her children will inherit her. Well, her children are from Shevet Yehuda. Her property is from Shevet Binyamin, which then turns out that tribal property of Binyamin can be transferred over to Yehuda. So at first they said, marry within your tribe. There's a big pool. Find a nice guy within your tribe. Parents still give this advice to their children today, right? Marry within your tribe. So the Gemara says, Rabbi Yudhi said the name of Shmuel, that Allah said Tu B'Av was the day when they allowed ultimately again people to intermarry into different tribes. So the Gemara said, my Dorish, what are they dashing to allow this? Zeh hadavar asher tziva Hashem b'nos tzlavchad. Davar zeh lo yehei noeg ela b'dor zeh. Because we'll say the pasuk by Benos Tzlafchad said this was the thing that Hashem commanded to the daughters of Tzlafchad, and the advice, what He commanded the daughters of Tzlafchad was marry within your tribe. So they darshan it was only to that generation, only to the daughters of Tzlafchad, which we'll say also makes sense. When you're establishing every tribe's portion, you don't want to stir the pot before things are solidified. But after that generation, inter-tribal marriages will be permitted. So that was a great simcha. I'll just point out over something very interesting. I saw a beautiful piece by the Novominsker, and the Novominsker paskins that halacha l'maisa, although you could marry into other tribes, if a woman was an only child, she would forfeit her inheritance. In other words, that you could intermarry, but you cannot move land from one tribe to another. So again, I just want to point out tribal geographic continuity was maintained. So you can marry whoever you want, but in certain circumstances, what might end up happening is you would forfeit your inheritance by marrying into another tribe. Okay, beautiful. Says the Gemara. Next, Rav Yosef said about Nachman, Yom Shehuter Shevet Binyamin Lava Bakal. Incredible. Tu B'Av was the day in which the tribe of Binyamin was permitted to marry into the general population of Klal Yisrael. We'll say, what is this referring to? This is referring to the episode of Pilegesh Begiva. There was a very traumatic story, literally again about a woman who was raped and ultimately died at the hands of the men of Shevet Binyamin. She was abused by the men of Shevet Binyamin, and her husband, who himself was no great tzaddik, right? Her husband, because he kicked her out of the house, wouldn't let her back in the house. Right? Her husband was so incensed about this, he dismembered her body, cut her up into 12 pieces, sent her to the Shvatim, and said, look what happened to my wife at the hands of Binyamin. The tribes went to war against, it's a traumatic story, against Shevet Binyamin, and there was a ban against allowing anyone to marry into Shevet Binyamin. That ban was lifted on Tu B'Av. Shene'emar, v'ish Yisrael mishpa b'mitzvah, v'imar, ish mimeno lo yitain bita lo Binyamin le'isha. Maidrosh, amarav mimenu, v'lo mibanenu. So we'll say ultimately they dashed, and this ban was a one-generation ban. And therefore, again, after one generation had gone by, they allowed people to remarry into Shevet. So we'll say what you begin to see is something very interesting. What's the common denominator so far between the first two reasons? Achdos, allowing the tribes to marry into each other, allowing Shevet Binyamin back into the union, that the simcha of Tu B'Av is a simcha of unity. Again, we'll see that theme. We're going to kind of take a detour from that theme, but then we'll see other ideas that loop back to this. Incredible. So, Amar Rav Rabbi Yochanan, Yom Shekalu Bo Meisei Midbar. We'll say this is wild. Tu B'Av is the day where Meisei Midbar, we'll say Meisei Midbar were the Jews who were destined to die in the desert. Remember again, as a result of the sin of the spies, it was decreed that anyone over the age of 20 will die in the desert. Tu B'Av was the day when Tu B'Av in the 40th year. In the 40th year was when they realized that the decree was effectively over. Now, why Tu B'Av? Rabbi said this is wild. Take a look at Rashi. Rashi says, Shakalu Meisei Midbar, Tisanya Kal Arbaim Shana B'Shahayu B'Midbar, B'Chal Erev Tisha B'Av, Haya Kruz Yotzei, V'Omer Tzu'u Lachbar, V'Haya Kol Echad V'Echad Yotzei V'Chofer Lo Kever, V'Yashin Bo, Shema Yomos Kodem Shiachbar. Rabbi say this is wild. What would happen every single night of Tisha B'Av? Because remember again, going back to yesterday's daf, remember what made Tisha B'Av the first event that created calendrical tragedy on Tisha B'Av was the sin of the spies. Spies come back on Erev Tisha B'Av on the 8th, deliver their report. Klal Yisrael cries on the night of the 9th. So what happened every year in the desert on Tisha B'Av? Listen to this. If you are above the age of 20, I'll say, listen to this. If you're above the age of 20, you dug a grave. And the night of Tisha B'Av, you slept in that grave. Because at the end of the day, remember again, there were too many people dying every year on Tisha B'Av. And there was a fear that if too many people died and graves were not dug, that could really be a disaster. So if you were above the age of 20, you dug your own grave the night of Tisha B'Av, and you slept there. The next morning, the next morning, somebody got up, made an announcement, let the living stand up. And whoever was alive stood up. And whoever wasn't alive didn't stand up. Every single year they did this. Listen to this. In the 40th year, says Rashi, Asu ulamachar amdu kulan. Something strange happened in year number 40. What happened? The next morning, what occurred? Everyone stood up. The Kevan Shiroke, Kach Tamov, Amru Shema Toim, Becheshmon HaChodesh, Chazru B'Shach B'Kibreim, Balaylos, Ad Chamisha Asar. So they thought, well, maybe we made a mistake with the calendar. So they did this for a bunch of nights until when? Until the 15th of Av. See, once the 15th of Av came, they realized we can't be making a mistake. How do we know we're not making a mistake? Look at the moon. The moon's full. So it's clearly the middle of the month. The Chevan Sherosh in Ismala Halavana Betuba Betesvav, Velo Meis Echar Mehem, Yadu Shechesh Bon Chadash Mechovan, the Kvar Mem Shana Shal Gezerah Nishlamu kavu oso kol kavu oso la osa yom yom tov. Shabbos say that year, Tu B'Av, on the 40th year in the desert, no one died that Tisha B'Av. Everyone got up the next morning, and they kept doing this over and over and over until the 15th of Av. Morning of the 15th of Av, or night of the 15th of Av, they see the moon is full. We're not making a mistake with the calendar. It must be that the Gzeira has come to an end. They made a Yom Tov. They made a Yom Tov. The Gzeira of the Meraglim had come to an end. New dawn, new day, new generation, new possibilities. We both say, Tosas says something absolutely amazing. Tosas says that based on this, what do you see? He says, if you look at the last couple lines of Tosas, Perish Hashvam, Kol Mem Sham Lo Hayu Mesim Ela B'Tes Ba'av, U'B'Chol Tes Ba'av Hayu Mesim Chaf Aleph Aleph Prut Prut. Shabbos, listen to this. Tosas says, based on this, in the desert during the 40 years, no one ever died except on Tisha B'Av. And every Tisha B'Av, 21,000 people and a little bit died. Every year, 21,000 people and a little bit, because that's the cheshbon. 21,000 people and a little bit died. The also put all of the mem shanim the test of elef. So we'll say, Tosas then quotes another opinion that no, people did die every single day in the desert. The majority of people died in the desert. So we'll say, just a fascinating historical machlokes. First opinion in Tosas, people only died on Tisha B'Av. They only died on Tisha B'Av. And 21,000 put and a bit died every single Tisha B'Av. 21,000 and a bit. A second opinion, no. People died every day in the desert also. People died every day, old age, whatever else. But the majority of people only died on the 9th of Av. Pretty incredible. So let's go back to Moshe. So therefore, again, another reason why they made Tu B'Av into a Yom Tiv is because, again, it was the day. We'll say, even though it sounds strange to make a Yom Tiv because people stopped dying. But remember, again, it doesn't just represent that people stopped dying. It represents the end of a decree. But the end of a decree also represents what? A new beginning. I will say, you know what this is reminiscent of? Exactly. Lag BaOmer. Right? It's interesting. What do we celebrate on Lag BaOmer? The Rama says, oh, Rabbi Akiva's students stopped dying. Really? Like that. By the way, you know Rabbi Akiva's students stopped dying? You know why they stopped dying? Because there was no one left. Right? In other words, not the shot they stopped dying and some were saved. They were all gone. 24,000 Talmidim were all gone. We'll say, but sometimes when the difficult chapter of life comes to an end, you know that something beautiful and magnificent is beginning. The scars and the wounds, the trauma is still fresh. But I also know that now that the period of trauma has closed, something else that is incredible is about to open. And the ability to celebrate a new beginning in the aftermath of trauma, ein simcha gidola mizal. There is no better simcha than that. So yes, on Tu B'Av, when we realize that the gzera of the Meraglim, the decree of the Meraglim, had effectively come to an end, that means that we're going into Eretz Yisrael. That means that there's a new beginning. That means that something magnificent is about to happen. The ability to celebrate in the aftermath of trauma is the greatest Yom Tov there is. So the Gemara goes back to, the Gemara says, furthermore, so the Gemara says, Amar Mar, Ad Shelo Kalu Meisei Midbar, Lo Haya Dibur Im Moshe. Furthermore, again, both say, so the Gemara essentially addresses this. What is it that we're celebrating? Because halacha l'maisa, as long as the decree was in effect, and the generation of the desert was still dying, literally it sounds like Hakadosh Baruch Hu didn't speak with Moshe. Now Rashi points out over here, Hashem did speak with Moshe, but it wasn't biyichud u'bechiba. It wasn't a loving exchange with Moshe. It wasn't a warm exchange with Moshe Rabbeinu, as long as the decree of the spies was still hovering over Klal Yisrael. Shneimar, vahi kasher tamu kol anshe milchama lamos, vayidaber Hashem Eli haya hadibar. So we'll say it's a third reason. Ultimately, again, the generation of the desert finishes dying out. HaKadosh Baruch Hu begins to speak with Moshe Rabbeinu with love and with connection. Again, celebration of a new future in the aftermath of trauma. Incredible Yom Tov. Next, Ula Amar Yom Shebita Hoshea ben Ela Prus doyos shahoshi v'yirava ben nebat ala drachim shelo yalu Yisrael l'regel va'amar top of Lamed Aleph Le'eza sheyirtze ya'aluf. So we'll say, what else happened on Tu B'Av? Moshe ben Elah, who was the last king over the Malchus of Israel, he removed the sentries which blocked people from going up to Yerushalayim. Remember, we made reference to this yesterday. Yoel ben Nevat, who was the first king over Malchus Yisrael, right? When the kingdom divided between Yehuda and Yisrael, Yoel ben Nevat was the first new king of Israel to solidify his monarchy. He started out as a good man, but power corrupted him. To solidify his power, he prevented people from being Ola Regel to the Beis Hamikdash, because he thought that if people are going to go to the Beis Hamikdash, I'm going to lose my hold on them. So what does he do? He posts sentries. So we'll say, so Hoshea ben Elah removed them. Now, Hoshea ben Elah wasn't such a tzaddik. Hoshea ben Elah says just pretty much like worship whoever you want, right? You want to worship idolatry, worship idolatry. You want to worship God, worship God. I'm not telling people who and what to worship. So that's another reason. But again, at the end of the day, halach l'maisa, we had the opportunity to go to Beis Hamikdash. Now, the tragic postscript was, we didn't go, right? The tragic postscript was, even when Hoshea ben Elah removed the sentries, it's not like there was a mass, what's the word? Aliyah l'regel, right? There just wasn't. After generations, essentially, of not going, we just didn't go. But in any event, so what do you see from here? Sometimes the greatest Yom Tiv is the celebration of opportunities, right? It's interesting. Nothing actually changed when Hoshea ben Elah removed the sentries, right? L'maisa, it's not like traffic increased unto the Beis Hamikdash, but there was opportunity. Sometimes the greatest Yom Tiv in life is a celebration of brand new opportunities. Whether we take them or not, that's up to us. Rav Masna Amar, Yom Shenasnu Haruge Beitar Lekvura. I will say this is incredible. Rav Masna says, what happened on Tu B'Av? Tu B'Av was the day in which we were finally permitted to bury the dead of Beitar. We spoke about this before. Beitar was destroyed on the 9th of Av, and it was on Tu B'Av that we were given the opportunity, 2 years later, right, to go ahead and bury the dead. The dead were left unburied. Remember, again, Beitar was the last holdout of the Bar Kokhba rebellion. We were finally given the opportunity to bury the dead. And I will say, a miracle occurred that the dead did not decompose. Animals did not pick at the dead. V'amrav Masna, O Seyom Shenitnu Haruge Beitar L'Kvura, that day in which we were permitted to finally bury Haruge Beitar, Tziknu B'Yavne Hatova Hametiv. The boss said, listen to this. They instituted the bracha of Hatova Hametiv. The bracha of Hatova Hametiv is the fourth bracha of benching, right? They instituted that bracha of Hatova Hametiv, right? Hatov Shelo Esrichu. Hashem is good in that He did not allow the bodies to decompose. V'Hametiv Shenatnu L'Kvura. And ultimately, again, He bestows good in that He allowed them ultimately, again, to be buried. I'll just point out something very interesting that I saw. That interestingly enough, we know that the bracha of Hatova Hametiv, the bracha of Hatova Hametiv is also said over wine, right? Different. Remember again, that Hatova Hametiv that we're referring to over here is the fourth bracha in benching. That was instituted as a gratitude to Hashem for allowing the dead of Beitar to be brought to burial. But you also say the bracha of Hatova Hametiv. We'll say when you drink wine. Now again, it's not just any wine, but let's say you're drinking white wine, and then you bring red wine to the table. You make an additional bracha of Hatova Hametiv. So the Mishnah Berurah quotes Rabbeinu Bachya, who says, why do we make Hatova Hametiv on wine? Right? The bracha of Hatova Hametiv is related to the bracha of Haruge Beitar. And the Mishnah Berurah says something amazing. Quote Rabbeinu Bachya, he says that at the end of the day, because when a person drinks wine, sometimes again, it may be like kalas rosh. Wine can lead to lightheadedness. I don't mean how you feel, but the type of behavior. Right? It could lead to lightheaded behavior. Chazal instituted a bracha of Hatova Hametiv on wine that reminds us of Beitar. That reminds us of dying al Kiddush Hashem. So that way, when a person drinks wine, they'll drink wine with the proper kovid rosh and won't allow the alcohol to chas v'shalom lead them to inappropriate behavior. Quite incredible. So the Gemara goes weiter. Rabba of Rav Yosef Damar Tarbayu Yom Shepaskum Lichlos Eitzim Ma'aracha. They both say, isn't this beautiful? What happened on Tu B'Av? It was the day when we stopped chopping wood for the Mizbeach, or for the pyre, literally. Again, it was the day in which we celebrated that there was enough wood in the Lishkas HaEitzim to take us through the winter. Now, I will say, now, why do you stop then? Because at Tu B'Av, at that point in time, from that point forward, the strength of the sun diminishes. Because the strength of the sun diminishes, the wood isn't as dry as it going forward, and therefore there's a concern that it becomes wormy. So we accumulate wood in the Beis Hamikdash prior to Tu B'Av, but post Tu B'Av we're no longer chopping wood and putting it in the Lishkas Ha'itzim because there's going to be too much moisture in the wood. So we'll say, what do we celebrate on Tu B'Av? That there is enough wood. There is enough wood in the Beis Hamikdash. So we'll say, what's the celebration? Because it's a good celebration when you have everything you need in life to kindle the requisite fire of Avodas Hashem. Right? When I know that I've got enough wood in the storehouse to kindle the fire of Avodas Hashem, that's a Yom Tov. When I know that I've acquired for myself enough fuel for the fire for the months ahead, Ein Yom Tov Gedol Mizo. So we'll say, well, let's finish. The Gemara says, Mikan Ve'ilach, ultimately, again, the strength of the sun is diminished, and they would not cut any more wood for the Beis Hamikdash. Ultimately, again, because the wood is no longer dry enough. Rav Nashia says, Tu B'Av, they used to call it V'karilei Yom Taver Magal. They used to call Tu B'Av the day of the broken axe. Right? In other words, that we would no longer chop wood from Tu B'Av and on. So the Gemara says, by the way, we'll say also from Tu B'Av and on is when the days get shorter and the nights get longer. Mikan ve'elech, demosif Yosef. I will say from here on in, and this is very shayach to us, demosif Yosef, he who adds Torah learning onto his nights, ultimately again will be given extra days. Udelo mosif, but he who does not add on extra Torah learning to his nights, as Rabbi say, from the period of time where the nights become longer than the days, a person has to add Torah onto their nights. Demosiv Yosef. If you add on more Torah to your nights, you'll be given more days. Udelo mosif ye'asef. And a person ultimately, again, who does not add on Torah to his nights, ultimately, again, ye'asef literally means will be collected. So the Gemara says, what does that mean? Ma ye'asef, Amrav Yosef, tikberei imei. His mother will bury him, which will say means an untimely death. So we'll say it's a very profound Gemara, because what the Gemara is saying is, and this is very shayach to us now, because right this time of year, the nights are longer, right? Long nights. When it's long nights, you have to add on more Torah to nights. Now the good part is about coming to Shir is that you're coming to Shir while it's still nights, right? So it actually counts, right? It counts. So this is actually a good argument to coming on time to Shir. Because a person comes on time to Shir, mamish, a person is adding on Torah during, in all seriousness, adding on all Torah to their nights. The idea that the Gemara is saying is, when the days are longer, you have to maximize your days. When the nights are longer, you have to maximize your nights. Whatever it is, right? Winter, summer, you gotta maximize whatever it is that is longer. If you maximize your time, HaKadosh Baruch Hu will increase your time. You don't maximize your time, why should HaKadosh Baruch Hu give me longevity? We'll say longevity is only given to those who utilize. The Gemara is saying longevity is given to those who maximize their time. If a person doesn't maximize their time, HaKadosh Baruch Hu, why should I give you longevity? What are you using it for? To enjoy more, to have more pleasure. What am I using my time for? So we'll say it's such a tifah moser. It's such a strong idea that HaKadosh Baruch Hu gives time to those who maximize that time. But if I don't maximize my time, then what right do I have to ask for more of it? So I will say, and just point out, this ends the discussion of Tu B'Av. So I just want to point out something amazing. So we have 1, 2, 3, 4, 5 different opinions, 6 different opinions as to why Tu B'Av is a Yom Tov. What I just want to point out to you is it's not mutually exclusive. Right? In other words, all the reasons work beautifully in concert together. So whether ultimately, again, the Shvatim were permitted to marry into each other, Binyamin is allowed back into the union, in which case Tu B'Av is a celebration of Achdus. Or ultimately, again, it was the day in which the generation of the Desert Chetim Meraglim came to an end. We're not celebrating the cessation of death, but rather we're celebrating, again, the re-energized relationship HaKadosh Baruch Hu has with Moshe Rabbeinu, and we're celebrating new opportunities in the aftermath of traumatic experiences. That's a simcha. Or the other possibility is, again, Yehoshua ben Elah took away the centuries. right? What are we celebrating? The greatest celebration of life is opportunities, right? We'll say the greatest thing in life is to know you have opportunities. So Shev and Ela removed the centuries, new opportunities. Ultimately, again, Rav Masna, the dead of Beitar were buried. Same idea. Bury the dead, nurse, right? Close out the wounds of the past so that you have the ability to build a beautiful future. Rabbi and Rav Yosef, there's enough wood in the Beis HaMikdash. Greatest celebration is to know that you have built up enough fuel inside of yourself to kindle your fire. The Mosif Yosef, the lo Mosif lo Yosef. You want more time from HaKadosh Baruch Hu? Make sure you can honestly say that you're maximizing the time that you have been given. Right, Rabbi say. So remember again, the last part of the Gemara talked about this interesting process that happened on Tu B'Av. And what happened on Tu B'Av? The girls would go out to dance in the vineyard. So what exactly is going on over here? So we'll say this is actually quite beautiful. Tan Rabbanon. So we'll say, Tan Rabbanon. Bas Melech Shoelas mi Bas Kohen Gadol. So we'll say, remember again, the Mishnah said all the girls would borrow clothing from each other in order that no one should feel left out, that even if someone who didn't have would be able to borrow from someone else. So Bas Melech Shoelas mi Bas Kohen. So the daughter of the king borrows from the daughter of the Kohen Gadol. Bas Kohen Gadol mi Bas Skan. The daughter of the Kohen Gadol borrows from the daughter of the assistant Kohen Gadol, the Skan. Bas Skan mi Bas Mashuach Milchama. The daughter of the Skan borrows from the daughter of the Mashuach Milchama, the Kohen who's anointed for battle. Ubas Mashuach Milchama mi Bas Kohen Hedyot. And the daughter of the Kohen Mashuach Milchama would borrow from the daughter of a regular Kohen. They both say, and everybody would borrow from each other, in order that no one should be embarrassed. They both say, what's fascinating about this? In other words, if you're going to say no one should be embarrassed, so what should happen? Right? What should happen? Right? Let it be a gemach, a clothing gemach. We'll say it's interesting because as much as the wife should be embarrassed, who does the daughter of the king borrow from? The daughter of the Kohen Gadol. In other words, we'll say, you see, what is important is not everyone is the same. Not everyone is the same. The daughter of the king is not like the daughter of a regular person. Is not like the daughter of a Kohen Gadol. In other words, that this notion sometimes that we have that everybody's equal, and everybody, I should say it differently, everybody is equal, but not everybody is the same. And this is so incredibly important. Everybody has their own role. Everyone has their own tachlis. And yes, certain people have their particular stations in life, which makes them different than other people. Again, there's an equality in that every single person is absolutely important. But there is no such thing that everyone is the same. See, even though we're going to have everybody go out and borrow from each other, the daughter of the king doesn't borrow from the daughter of just a regular girl. Right? She goes down one step. She'll borrow from the daughter of the Kohen Gadol, because the preservation of different roles and different responsibilities and different offices and different stations is incredibly important within Klal Yisrael. We'll say, think about this just a second. Can everybody be a Kohen Gadol? What happens if everybody be a Kohen Gadol? What would happen? There's no minyan at the Levaya, right? That's what happens. You can't have everybody being the same. But that being said, there are different stations, there are different roles, there are different responsibilities. So the Gemara goes right there. The Gemara says, "Es mi she'elo kol hakelin ton kvila." So I'm sorry, kol hakelin ton kvila. So just remember again, because everybody's borrowing from each other, you also have to immerse all the garments, because it's possible that maybe some of the garments have become ritually impure. Amr Belazar afilu mikupalin umunachem mikufsa. Even if there's a garment that's folded up and put away, so it was clearly again laundered, no one wore it, you still have to immerse it. In other words, halacha l'maisa, every article of clothing requires immersion. Again, this is just in order not to embarrass anyone. Beautiful. So Benos Yisrael Yotos v'cholos b'kramim. Shabbos said the girls would go out and dance in the vineyards. Tana, Misha ein lo isha nifna l'sham. I will say, why are the girls going out to the vineyard? This is a singles event. This is singles event. I'm going to tell you something shocking. There are no shadchanim. Oh my gosh. People actually met each other organically. I know, it's crazy. It's absolutely wild. But once upon a time, people were normal. And once upon a time, you see someone, hi, I'm Shmuel, hi, right? It's incredible, people, right? So again, in a controlled environment, right? Bikdusha ubitara, choreographed by the Mishnah, there is a way to be normal. It's possible. Again, we live in different times, obviously. The world has changed so much. But it is fascinating to see what the Gemara says. By the way, you're looking for a girl? Fantastic. They're out in the fields dancing. Why don't you go and meet someone? Right? Put yourself together, right? Change that shirt that you've been wearing for 3 weeks, right? And go ahead, right? Go and meet someone. Says the Gemara as follows. So Misha in lo isha nifna l'sham. So we'll say it's incredible. So remember again, the girls would say different things. Miyuchaso sheba and hayu omros bachar. Tanra we'll listen to this. Different girls said different things to the boys. Tanra the women who were pretty, the women who were beautiful, what would they say? Tinu einechem liyofi. They would tell the young men, choose a bride based on beauty. She'ein ha'isha ela liyofi. Literally translated, it means for a woman is only for beauty. What does this mean? So they were saying to the boys, the attraction, right? Attraction is such an important thing. So choose your wife based on attraction. Everything else you could work out, but attraction, if it's there, it's there. If it's not, it's not. So ultimately, again, choose a wife based on attraction. Miyuchaso shebahen, the girls who had good yichus, right? Meaning they came from good families. What would they say? Mahayu omros. What would they say? Tinu einechem lemishpacha. Go ahead and look at the family. In other words, don't just get focused on beauty, right? But rather look at the family which a girl comes from. Because what's the goal of a marriage? The goal of a marriage, hopefully, is the establishment of a family. And ultimately, again, if a girl comes from a good family, hopefully she will know how to raise good children. Michu oros shebahem. So we'll say, so the girls who weren't as beautiful, and the girls who perhaps ultimately, again, maybe didn't come from the best families, what would they say? Mahayu omros, what would they say? Marry a woman for the sake of Shem Shemayim. In other words, they're both saying, what they were saying ultimately was to these young men is, look, beauty comes and goes. Family's nice, but the truth is the family you came from is no guarantee about the family you're going to build. But rather, again, the Maharsha points out what they were saying is, why don't you look at the midos of a girl? Instead of, looks are external. Even family is something external. As much as it's beautiful that, yes, to marry someone from a wonderful family, I'll say there are plenty of people who come from wonderful families and make dramatically different life decisions. The family you come from is no guarantee about who you're going to become. So because the Michu'aros means the girls who weren't pretty, the Maharsha says it doesn't mean that. It's just talking about girls who said, don't focus on external things when choosing a spouse, because looks come and go. They're not unimportant, but that can't be the sole determinant because they come and go. Family is great, but it's not necessarily a determinant of who you are or what you're going to build. But rather, again, what should you do? Look at who I am. Literally means marry for the sake of heaven. But what it means is the girls were saying, look at my midos. Look at who I am. Look at my qualities as a human being. And you'll see, ultimately, again, I have so much to offer. This is great. But you have to buy me jewelry. Right? However, right? So the idea, the girls were saying, as much as at the end of the day, it's not about the externalities, but jewelry is nice. Which the Maharsha also points out that, again, what the girls are also saying is, even if you think I'm not attractive, with the right accessories, ultimately, again, the attraction could be there. Amar Ula Bira, Amar Belazar. So we'll say the Gemara ends. So we'll say, so just to point out, so this is what would happen on Tu B'Av. And I will say, actually, it's quite amazing. It makes sense that this would happen on Tu B'Av, because you see that the first of the 6 reasons were all about marriage. Right? It's all about marriage. Shvatim can marry into each other. Shevet Binyamin is allowed back into the union. So it makes sense that Tu B'Av was a day of Shidduchim. It was a day of Shidduchim. And the Gemara says, what would happen? The girls would go out. And again, the girls would go out, and different women, different girls had different things to offer. So some people, all they have is to offer is looks. Other people have ultimately yichos. Some people have midos. Some people have everything. But the idea, they said to the young men, if you're looking for a shidduch, Ultimately, again, Tu B'Av is the day to go. And I will say the beautiful part of it was, see, here's what's interesting, is all the girls, all the women are borrowing clothing from each other in order that no one should present differently than their fellow. To create, to a certain degree, a great equalizer within Klal Yisrael. It's really, really quite beautiful. It's actually be interesting to know historically, like how many shidduchim came out of these types of gatherings. I don't know, the Gemara doesn't tell us that. But we'll say, but let's end off. We'll say a beautiful and moving Gemara. Amir Rabbi Lazar. Asira Kodesh Baruch Hu lasas machal letzadikim. Kodesh Baruch Hu ultimately again will make a machal. We'll say machal is a circle for the tzadikim. Fu yoshev beinehem began Eden. And HaKadosh Baruch Hu ultimately again will sit. Rashi says machal is saviv. Will sit. So we'll say, if you could imagine the imagery, what happens in the afterlife in Gan Eden. So ultimately, again, or it could also be a reference to the Messianic era. HaKadosh Baruch Hu will create a circle for the tzaddikim, and the tzaddikim sit all around HaKadosh Baruch Hu. V'chol echad ve'echad mare be'etzba'o, and every single person, the Moshe is in the middle of the circle, and all of the tzaddikim point with their finger and they say Shne'emar va'amar b'yomahu. They will say on that day, Hine Elokeinu. Here is our God. So we'll say it's a reference to the fact that in Gan Eden they're pointing at HaKadosh Baruch Hu. Hine Elokeinu. Here is our God. Zeh kivinu lo. This is the God we had always hoped for. This is the God we had always pined for. V'yoshienu. And this is the God who ultimately provides our salvation. Zeh Hashem kivinu lo. This is the God we had hoped for, we had pined for. Nagila v'nismacha b'shuaso. Ultimately, again, we will rejoice. And we will rejoice, we will celebrate in his salvation. So I will share with you something beautiful. The Bnei Yisachar quotes this idea, quotes over here from the Abdurrah, from the Oriya Tahel. He says, what's the pshat, what's the imagery over here? That the tzaddikim are sitting in a circle around that Kodesh Baruch Hu, and they're pointing towards the Rebbe Shalom. So listen to these words Rabbi said. This is beautiful. He says, this ties in. This is all part of the same Gemara. He says, this is also part of the Tu B'Av Gemara. How so? We'll say, listen to this. Dihine, inyan ha'machol hu, ha'holich b'machol, holich saviv b'hekif, ve'in sham maila umata rosh v'sof. So we'll say, the Bnei Yisachar says so beautifully, that at the end of the day, the beauty of a circle is there is no beginning, there is no end. Right? No one's at the front of the circle. No one's at the back of the circle. Right? The circle is the same. And again, if it's a good circle, everyone is equidistant to the center. To the center. Listen to what the Rabbi says. Kain lo yelet tzadikim la'asid kina v'sina lomar zega bo l'mala mizeh. So we'll say ultimately again, says the Bnei Yisachar, according to the Abdurrah of the Oriya Tahel, sometimes even amongst the tzadikim of the generation, there's animosity. And there's strife. This one says, I'm greater. This one says, I'm greater. This one disparages this one. This one says, no, you're wrong. You're this, you're that. And sometimes even amongst the tzaddikim of the generation, there is strife and discord. What happens in Gan Eden? In Gan Eden, all of the tzaddikim are in a circle. In Gan Eden, ultimately again, there is no kina. There is no sinah. There is no jealousy. There's no animosity. V'hu hu yamtiv li Yisrael kishe'ein beinehem kina v'sinah v'sachar. So we'll say, what's the ultimate yamtiv for Klal Yisrael? The ultimate yamtiv? When there is shalom between leaders. When there is shalom between tzaddikim. You see, if the tzaddikim argue, then of course their constituents are going to argue. If the leaders argue, then of course the followers are going to argue. The ultimate yamtiv, says the Bnei Yisachar, is when the tzaddikim are dancing in a circle around that Kodesh Baruch Hu. When the tzaddikim could hold hands, when the tzaddikim could be makir each other, when the tzaddikim could respect one another, when the tzaddikim, when there's no kina, there's no sinah, and everyone together points at HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's a yamtiv. So says the Bnei Yisachar, what does this have to do with Tu B'Av? Rabbi say, listen to this. He says, V'zeu remez. There's no gradient of the Mishnah says than Tu B'Av. Rabbi say 2 is 15. What's the 15th letter of the Hebrew alphabet? Says the Bnei Yisachar. It's a samach. It's a samach. And Rabbi say, what's the samach? The samach is a circle. Lo hayu yamim tovim kitu be'av. There is no greater yomtiv than the 15th letter of the Aleph base, the Samech, the circle, that when the tzaddikim are ultimately again making the machal, ultimately again making the circle around that Kadosh Baruch Hu. When there's shalom amongst the tzaddikim, when there's shalom amongst the leaders, that shalom trickles down to the constituents as well. And when there's shalom, that's ultimately when all of us could point to HaKadosh Baruch Hu and we could say, Ze Elokeinu, Ze Kivinu Lo V'Yosheinu, Ze Hashem Kivinu Lo, Nagila V'Nisnucha B'Shos. Rabbi say, I'll end off with one last piece. Really end off with one last piece. Rabbi say it's also amazing because the word machal doesn't just mean circle. What else does machal mean? Machalach, forgiven. That perhaps what also happens is as follows: that sometimes there is a lot of discord, there is a lot of machogas, there is a lot of fighting. But sometimes people really do have the right intentions. Just the execution and the actualization of those intentions are flawed. HaKadosh Baruch Hu asala, HaKadosh Baruch Hu machal. Asa HaKadosh Baruch Hu lasos machal letzadikim. HaKadosh Baruch Hu will grant mechila to the tzadikim if their intentions were l'shem shamayim, if their intentions were for the good purposes, even if what? Even if at the end of the day the execution was a little bit flawed. There'll be mechila. If you have good intentions, but you kind of burn out on the execution, HaKadosh Baruch Hu says, I'll grant you mechila. But Abba, look how the Masechta ends. What does HaKadosh Baruch Hu want from us more than anything? He just wants us to dance in a circle. He just wants us to dance in a circle. He wants us not to fight. He wants us not to say, I'm better than you, I know more than you, I know this, I know that, I have this, you don't have. He just wants us to dance in a circle, recognizing that we are all the same distance, and not even this, we're all the same closeness to HaKadosh Baruch Hu. That's all the Ribono Shel Olam wants. And when we find the courage to dance in a circle with each other, stop trying to one-up the other, stop trying to prove the other wrong, but we're willing to live b'shalom, hold hands, and dance together around HaKadosh Baruch Hu, that's when we'll be zocheh to say, Hine Elokeinu Zeh. That's when we'll be zocheh Amirat Hashem to see the Ribono in such a real way that we'll be able to say, this is my Ribono Shalom. Rabosai, Mazel Tov on Maseches Taanis, B'Shah Tov Maslachas. Tomorrow we begin Maseches Megillah. Shkayach, everyone.